Jeff, great to be here on the WatchPitch Podcast. I'm so excited about this conversation that we're about to have because of your experience and, of course, your perspective in the world of mergers and acquisitions and, of course, exits and exit strategies. Because I think at some point, every founder, every CEO is looking at that mark in their future and knowing that there is going to be some kind of exit. And oftentimes, that is brought up in a conversation with any kind of potential investor for a startup and entrepreneur is what is your exit strategy? So I think you're going to lend a lot of gravitas and a lot of value to our listeners with this particular topic. And just to sort of let our listeners know a little bit more about you in this world of mergers and acquisitions. I know currently you're a managing partner at Viking, whose sole purpose is mergers and acquisitions, but it'd be great to sort of invite you into giving the listeners and viewers a little bit more of an idea about who you are and how you fit into that ecosystem.
Well, Trey, first of all, let me thank you for the opportunity to come and speak with you today.
Of course.
It was a pleasure meeting you recently at a 1 Million Cups event.
That's right.
And I'm really impressed by your podcast and WatchPitch, and I feel it's an honor to be here today.
Oh, thanks.
But to give you a little bit of a background, I'm unusual in one sense in that I'm from Western North Carolina. I've lived here all my life. Haven't done a lot of business here until joining Viking Mergers and Acquisitions. Early in my career, I had the great fortune of working for a global company, and that company in the late 1990s, early 2000s, was deeply engaged in merger and acquisition activity. At the time, I was fortunate to work on the integration side, which is after a deal gets done, then there's the integration portion, making things work. And through that experience, I was recruited to go to work for another global company based out of Baltimore, Maryland, and I was able to continue the merger and acquisition activity there. Through that, I was then able to, unfortunately, start my own company. And believe it or not, it had nothing to do with mergers and acquisitions. But in December of 2009, myself and two partners started the company. And we started with the end in mind. It was a 10-year plan. We said in 10 years, we're wanting to sell this company. And we were fortunate. We hit all of our marks. We grew the business successfully. And we were able to sell it actually in year 7. And so it was purchased by a publicly traded company out of Paris. And so after exiting that business, I wanted to come back home, so to speak. And so I was able to join forces with Viking Mergers, which is based in Charlotte. It's one of the largest small business merger and acquisition firms in the Southeast. And they were looking for someone to lead the effort here in Western North Carolina and East Tennessee. And so it's been good. I've really enjoyed getting back to Western North Carolina. As I said, I've always lived here, haven't done a lot of business here. And I think what I can bring to small business owners is that expertise in helping them sort of see and develop and design an exit plan for themselves, their business, and hopefully they're able to enjoy the fruits of their labor, so to speak.
Well, super juicy because I'm so curious about the culture of exits being in the DNA of founders as they either are at the starting gates, like your company in particular, or at least at some point in their relationship with their business, then identifying, wow, I think someday I really do want to sell this business or find a merger or be acquired. And sometimes people don't realize that that takes time and a lot of thought. This isn't something where you flip a switch and go, all right, now I want to leave this. So having the exit in mind at the beginning seems to be a critical part of the equation when either starting a business and or continuing to build that business to meet certain benchmarks that then are sort of indicating, yeah, I think we could do an exit here. I think the pressure of investors early on are automatically bringing that conversation into the equation. But I would imagine a lot of people who start businesses don't really think about exiting them necessarily at the very beginning.
Yeah, and that's a shame in many ways, because only 20 to 25% of small businesses will ever be sold. And that doesn't mean that every business can be sold, but those businesses that are productive and are profitable and have the potential for being sold, many of those will never be sold. And the owners will never benefit from having grown that business and
Right.
putting all the time and all the effort and all the resources and all their capital, all their passion and all their purpose and everything into that business, and then they won't be able to capitalize on that.
Right.
And one of the things we do with Viking is that we like to educate business owners as to what the potential is. Now, the other end of the spectrum is the startup that tries to design that exit plan too soon. Now, I say that having already told you that I started the business with a plan to exit the business. But I had a little bit of a different situation there. I knew the industry, I knew the business, I knew what could be accomplished. And then I was also at a stage of saying, I will put 10 years into this, and after 10 years, I want to be ready to do something else. And so I had a lot more clarity, I think, of what that trajectory would look like. But we run across a spectrum of individuals in the business world. Every week, I get a call from a business owner who has an idea. They're in the startup phase, and they're already thinking about selling it. And, I have to let them
Wait,
know.
they're in the idea stage?
They're in the idea stage, okay?
It does seem a little early.
And they're trying to see how they can capitalize on their idea. Or they may have a product or a service that at this stage isn't mature enough to really think about selling. Now, what I like to advise business owners to do is to establish the business, grow the business, prove that the business is viable. It needs to be profitable. It needs to have growth potential. It needs to have a history of growth. Our investors, the people that we're working with, and we have right now over 2,500 qualified investors that are part of our network. What they're looking for is they're looking for cash flow. They're looking for growth potential. They're not speculators. They're really looking for a viable business to purchase. In some of those cases, they're looking to make the investment and then have the existing management continue to stay on and run the business and grow the business. And in some cases, they're looking at buying the business and integrating the business into their portfolio of holdings. So there's a different spectrum. But one of the things that I do tell all prospective business sellers is that buyers are smart people, too. And what they're buying is really the cash flow of that business, current and future. And so if they're starting a business and you've got it to a point to where it is profitable, it is growing, it's got a good potential, then the owner at that point should start taking some time to think about the future, to think about possibly what's next for them, what's next for the business. And I can tell you from personal example that it takes time. When my partners and I had first started talking about selling our company, I met with a very well-experienced M&A attorney in Charlotte. I presented to him the business, gave him the history, gave him the financial status. We went through consultation, and he told me that if I started at that moment, that I could expect 3 to 8 years before I exited.
Goodness.
Yeah.
You already had the results.
Already had
You already had the traction.
already had the traction, already had grown the business,
and it
already
would
had
still
proven
take
it.
that long.
And he said, plan on 3 to 8 years. It took 5 years from that day until I exited the business. Now, almost 2 years of that was with the acquiring company, which wanted me to stay on post-acquisition.
I see.
And that was part of the purchase agreement. So 2 years of that. So, it does take time. And it's not transactional. Very few businesses are transactional when they're sold, meaning a buyer comes in, We're just going to buy the business and off you go, and hope you have a great life. I tell business owners and business sellers that it's non-transactional, it's transformative. And you've got to understand the transformation that is happening. It's not just an easy once and done type of transaction. So I try to coach owners on that and let them know that if they do have a good, sound, solid business, it is profitable, it is growing, it does have continued growth potential, then we can talk about, what that plan is. One of the things I like about what's happening here in Western North Carolina is that there's what I consider to be ample resources and expertise on startups and scale up and growth and early stage companies. One of the things that we're doing with Viking is we're very supportive of various organizations here in Western North Carolina that are focused on that. We don't try to replicate those resources. But what we're hoping to do is start working on the other end of the spectrum and start educating business owners as to how small business M&A occurs, how it works, what to expect, how to plan for that, how to get the most value out of their company. Oftentimes we're meeting with businesses that have more potential value, but it means doing things differently than what they're currently doing. So there's a lot to it. There's a whole lot more to it than what most business owners realize that there is.
I got to believe that. And I want to really focus here on a point you made earlier with regards to your type of investors. And I'd love to know if you feel like there's a difference between the merger and acquisition investor partners who are working with you, who are looking at cash flow. It's not about the idea. It's not even about, and this is where my question lands, it's not even about the jockey. It's not even about the founder. They're looking at the revenue, existing and future potential. And that's really what's being invested in. Like the technology maybe they're completely agnostic about, or even the actual client base could be completely agnostic. It's really looking at the numbers. And if the numbers aren't, quote unquote, adding up, then they're not interested. And that's a different tone than what is often expressed in the startup and entrepreneurial community, where people are really on fire about their new ideas or ideas that they think are fresh, that haven't been seen, that are sort of market innovators or people who are disturbing the current marketplace because of a product or an idea. They haven't even gotten to the point of revenues, but they are having to have the conversation with investors who most of the time are being pitched something that might be very attractive to their values or their expertise. So this is really, I think, categorically another level of looking at businesses in the context of an exit. And I think, to me, that's fascinating, because now we're almost removing, you tell me, we're almost removing the human factor and just looking at the actual results. Now, the results, of course, are being driven by humans, but at the end of the day, it's really not about the leadership even. It's really just about the results the leadership is generating. And I would have, a lot of times in mergers and acquisitions, there is some kind of clause in there that requires those original founders to be on board for 1 to 2 years to be sure the continuity and maybe the cultural integration of the merger acquisition is handled smoothly. And I'm sure that you've got deep experience with that. But again, I think this is a very sobering point to all of our listeners, is that, at the end of the day, it really is about the numbers.
That's correct. We've got a saying that cash flow is king. And when our investors and buyers are looking at a business, it's on the other end of the spectrum than what a lot of investors are looking at making into a startup or an idea or a concept. I'll give you a profile of what our buyers look like. about 60% of the buyers in our network are well-capitalized individuals. They have made their money. Some of them are former business owners. Some have exited corporate positions. They have built wealth in a variety of different ways. They have knowledge of what it takes to make money, and they have the money to buy a business. They are going to buy that business as an individual, and then oftentimes they're going to either operate that business, or they're going to hire a management team, or they're going to even perhaps keep the current management team and the owners on board. But they're looking at it from strictly a return on investment standpoint. That's when I get back to telling sellers, buyers are smart people too. They understand how businesses operate because they have themselves been able to acquire the capital in order to make the investment. So that's about 60% of who we deal with are individual investors. Somewhere in the neighborhood of about 30% are strategic buyers. They are
like
existing companies.
sector-specific?
They are existing companies. They may have a portfolio of companies in a certain industry or related industries. And so they're looking at an acquisition to be able to fold into their existing business as an extension of that business to help them grow through acquisition, to maybe complement the businesses that they already have. So they probably have a better understanding of what that business is that they're looking to acquire and how it fits into the grand scheme of what they're trying to accomplish as a company. And then only about 10% of who we deal with are private equity groups. Private equity groups tend to do things their own way and in their own way. It's not to say that it's right or wrong. It's just the way that they operate and their objectives in making an acquisition. So that sort of gives you an idea of who we're dealing with. But you're right in the sense that the pool of prospective buyers, the universe that we're working in, are typically not interested in early stage companies, not interested in ideas. They're looking for well-established companies. So as I often attend, our pitch events and our startup events and those type of things, which again, we're completely supportive of.
Yeah, I see that.
And I look at it like this. I've even been questioned, why do you spend so much time
with these startups? Yes, right.
They're not your target market.
Right.
And I look at it like this. It's like a sustainable forest. We're going out and we're helping take out the old growth timber, the mature companies. Okay, we're helping those business owners recognize and capitalize on their years of hard work and effort and all that they've put into their business. But we're also investing and replanting, if you will, so that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, there's going to be a new harvest of companies out here. So we sort of see it in a holistic way that, we want to give back to the business community and help support the young companies, the startup companies, the ideas and the concepts and the scale-ups and those type things, so that the economy of Western North Carolina particularly, but we do it in other areas that we operate as well, but the economy here will continue to flourish and there'll continue to be good opportunities. I really get excited when I hear some of the ideas and the concepts and the pitches, and I'm thinking I'll check back in about 5 years and
see if they're still around.
Yeah, see what's going on there. But that's the difference in how the investors that we deal with look at a business versus some of the others.
And knowing then that you have this culture of clients who are investors in that 60-30-10 spread, with those understandings and experience, their outcomes that they're striving for, in addition to continued cash flow and a good return, I'm wondering how that might differentiate from many of the investors who are looking at a unicorn opportunity where they're thinking, well, I'm going to 10x this. And you hear this a lot from angel investor groups who say, all right, we're going to put together some money here in this space. And as a angel investor, you can expect 8 out of 10 of these opportunities that you invest in, say over a couple of years, are going to fail. But the 2 that do quite well, you can expect a 10x return. And so it's worth it for those types of investors to be in that space. and granted, angel investors are typically individuals, there's still a culture of investors for that kind of space that to me is quite a bit different than what you're describing from your own client base. Are there kind of minimum returns that people are looking for? Because you're still taking a risk by investing in a business, but certainly you've mitigated those a little bit, of course, because you've got this track record, whereas a startup probably doesn't.
That's a great idea. Let me describe a little bit about how we go about valuing a company, and that'll give you some insight into how we work with a prospective buyer, and it will then help explain what our investors are looking at.
Okay.
We go through an extensive process of valuation. We have a proprietary model that's been built over 23 years that Viking has been in business. It all starts with the financials. You know, we require the last 3 to 4 years of tax returns, P&Ls, balance sheets, all the financial information and documentation, and we begin with that. Oftentimes we'll get contacted by a company and they'll say, well, you know, some of our revenue doesn't get reported. And we're like, we're not the firm for you, okay, because our process is very rigid in the way that we do evaluation on a company. So as we work through that, and then we, of course, go out to our databases and we pull comps and we go to industry standards, and we have a way of working through the reconciliation of all of these numbers, and we're going to put a range of value on that business that we believe that in an arm's length transaction in an open marketplace, this is what the business is worth today. And in doing that, we're also looking at it from a buyer's perspective. We've got a model built that we're going to work through, and we're going to come up with assuming different things, assuming if it's an individual investor, are they going to get a loan to buy the business? If they do, then what is going to be the debt service on that, and what is the debt service as a percentage of cash flow? We're going to be looking at return on investment. We're going to be looking at a return on equity. And we're asking ourselves as we work through this model, how does this look from a buyer's perspective? And if it doesn't look like it's going to work out from a buyer's perspective, then we're going to be honest with the business seller and say, here are some things that you perhaps need to do before you take your business to market. We sell 75% of our listings. According to the International Business Brokers Association, the average business broker of our type, size, and scope sells about 22% of their listings.
Goodness.
So we have a very high batting
impressive.
average, and people say, well, what's different? And I think it's because we put so much time on the front end of understanding what the true value of this business is. And then also we're looking at it from a buyer's perspective, and we're going to look at it from a lender's perspective. And we're going to have looked at this thing through so many different angles that we've got a very high confidence level when we list that business that we're going to be able to sell it, and it's going to sell for the value that we've put on it. And then when the buyers come in, what we find typically is the buyers are going to look at it through pretty much the same lens that we did.
Yeah, sure.
And they're going to agree that, yeah, these numbers are pretty solid. So our buyers are not gamblers. You know, they're not going to the casino. And
so they're not planning on losing out on 80% of these potential deals. Yeah, and then feeling okay about that.
No.
Yeah.
That's a big difference in how the different ends of the investor spectrum operate. You know, our buyers are looking to buy a good, sound, solid business, get a return on their investment, and then be able to grow that business over a period of time for whatever strategy they have. Some of our buyers are buy and hold investors. Some of ours are looking for 5 to 7 years perhaps, and then they're going to
exit as well.
So, but they're very savvy when it comes to understanding what the numbers are. And I think that is one of the biggest differences that I see.
Gosh, yes. I think the other thing that I'd be curious about with regards to those investor types is how often you find your buyers or clients who are investing interested in kind of that industry or the operations of the business, and do they want to roll up their sleeves and get into that business because they have maybe some expertise that they recognize could add value, not just their capital, but they've actually got expertise that could add value to that business. Because I know that oftentimes when startups and entrepreneurs are courting investors, it's always encouraged to, find a good fit with your investors, especially at that early stage, because, startups and entrepreneurs need to be reminded it's not just their capital you're getting in this deal. Mm-hmm. You want to be sure that they have expertise that can add value to your business because they have expertise in that industry. Is that also the case with your buyers? Are they adding sort of cultural or experiential value to the equation, or is it really just their capital that they're investing?
No, oftentimes, and probably more often than not, they have something as a buyer. They have something to bring to the table that's going to be beneficial to that company. We do a great job of vetting the buyers. We have a process that we go through. When I talked about over 2,500 qualified buyers in our network, that's not just a name in our database. That means that we have gone through a process of vetting and qualifying that buyer to our standards. By the time they're entered into our database as a prospective buyer, we have a non-disclosure agreement with them. We've got their financial profile, and we've conducted an interview. We understand their background, what they're looking for, and what type of business really fits their background, their history, because what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to bring buyers to our client, the seller, that are not just financially capable of buying the business, but also have something that they're going to be able to add to that business. I'll give you an example. I've got a company right now that I'm working with here in Western North Carolina. It's a great company. They're a manufacturer. The way I describe it to prospective buyers is that they're a good old-fashioned roll-up-your-sleeve, grease-under-your-fingernails manufacturer. And if a buyer's not interested in that type of business, there's no need for me to try to sell them on that type of business.
Right. Yeah,
what I'm looking for is to be able to bring buyers that are going to be able to understand that business, okay, and to be able to not only financially do the deal, but also make it successful post-acquisition.
Right.
It's been said, and I believe this, having been in the M&A world for as long as I have, that over 60, and some even say as much as 70% of acquisitions fail to ever recognize the potential that was forecasted prior to acquisition.
Wow. That's almost a fail rate.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that is because the way that companies look at doing an acquisition and sometimes get unrealistic in what the potential for that business is. And there's a lot of other reasons as well that can be cultural. It can be the way that they attempted integration and those type things. Fortunately for Viking, we only, I would say probably less than 5%, if we went back and did the analysis of the businesses failed in the few years after acquisition. I think part of that is the testimony that we do in bringing buyers to the opportunity that really have something more to add than just the financial aspect of it.
So when you get to a point when a company owner is in that acquisition or merger process, and I imagine that those founders or that leadership team who have chosen to go down that path may be going down for personal reasons, maybe health, it may be just I want to do something different. I would imagine a lot of them are kind of tired, or at least just thinking, you know what, I'm done. I'm done with the grease under my fingers kind of thing. And I'm curious when this acquisition or merger experience happens for that company, is there already some leadership identified in advance, knowing that, okay, this team, is either going to leave right away, or they're going to leave after our 2-year kind of transition mark. Do you find that you're already kind of doing some work with regards to finding that replacement leadership team in that merger acquisition process?
What we do when we go through the assessment ourselves, we're asking those questions.
You are, yeah.
And if we identify that the business owner is the business,
right, that's a yellow flag.
That's a yellow flag that has to be addressed. We've often recommended that the business owner start mentoring or developing or even hiring someone who can run the business post-acquisition. That's such a large yellow flag with a lot of buyers that as soon as they see that there's no continuity plan in place, then there's a big risk of failure. So when we see that the business is the individual, then we have to start coaching on how is that going to be resolved.
Right.
I'll give you an example. I was contacted about 15 years ago. I was working in corporate M&A. I was contacted by a business owner in St. Louis. Great business. And I had known about the business. And we had made an acquisition of a company that was a competitor to his company. So he insisted that we should look at his company and buy his company.
Curious.
And so I flew out with the CFO, and we sat down, and he had all his financials out, and I reviewed the financials, and at the end I said, we can't buy your company. And he said, why not? I said, you are the company. I said, let me explain.
And you could tell that from the financials?
I knew from the history of the company.
Yeah, I see.
I knew from the history of the company. And when he told me that he was ready to retire, he had a son that was working in the business, and I asked about the son, and he said, no, he's planning on quitting. And I said, well, you are the business. So if we buy your business and I go in and tell your large customer, who I knew as well, that I'm replacing you and you're no longer a part of this, then that's going to be a problem. And so we had to have that conversation. And that was the main reason that we did not pursue acquiring that company. He was the company. And so when we have that situation, as far as Viking goes, we start coaching pretty early on in the process. And oftentimes the seller, the business owner, will take our advice and we'll work on a plan. And it's not unusual for us to spend a year, 2 years, or even more just working through all these issues to ready that business for market.
Gosh, so critically helpful. So what I'd love to do is to just review for a moment the kind of quintessential essentials for any startup entrepreneur, any business owner at this point, that what they have to have in place in order to at least ensure to the highest percentage possible a successful exit. Because I think, certainly one of those, just to seed this, is great financials. Like that record keeping is key. If you don't have that, if that hasn't been sort of emboldened into your business ops, then you need to start right away, because anybody that's going to come through the door, who's going to be interested in that business, is going to need to be sure that those are all polished, along with those tax returns. Like, these are sort of fundamental elements. I'd love to have you go through at least those fundamentals and thinking about this through the context of any startup or entrepreneur in particular, who's actually either already launched or certainly near the launch and realizing, okay, I've got to put these things into place right now if I'm really thinking about an exit at some point. And everybody should be thinking about that at some point. Nothing's forever. So if you're going to, put your blood, sweat, and tears into something, what are those essentials?
Well, you touched on one of the major ones, which is the financials. I give business owners the advice, especially if they're starting out, start out with a really good, competent CPA. And on the flip side of that, I say also have a really good, competent attorney from the beginning. And start building your business as though someday you're going to sell it. and start with the end in mind. We all say it. It's cliche. I think it was the second habit, if I remember correctly,
Right. Yes.
of Stephen Covey's.
Right.
But it's easier to say than to do.
Right.
But
Absolutely.
begin working toward that end and putting things in order. Financials are one. We talked about the financials. Let's talk about organizational. As you're building out your organization, are you working on the business or you're working in the business? There again, that's often said, but what we're looking for is a team that can transition over to a new owner. Organizationally, how are you set up? Do you have salespeople? Do you have a marketing department? Do you have operations? And we're talking about companies now that have been in operation for some time. Are you still running just as a mom and pop shop? One of the things that we do is we really focus on larger small businesses. We're talking now companies that are doing enterprise value of $1 million or higher, going up to 25 or 30 million. And companies of that size should start having some really good organization in place. I like to see companies that have good documentation in place of how things operate.
I'm hearing that.
How does your purchasing operate? How does your invoicing operate? Who's doing your bookkeeping? If you've got several employees working, is there someone managing the HR issues and functions of that company? How structured is this? You really want to begin putting your house in order, so to speak. And then once you beyond that, you're starting to look at how does your position in the marketplace look? Are you leveraged against one or two or three large accounts?
Right.
Or do you have a large diversified client base? Those things will come into play in either increasing or decreasing, or maybe even making your business sellable or not sellable. And so it's really good to get someone who's experienced to come in, sit down, and that's what we do. We do a no-cost, no-obligation consultation. And because we understand what it takes to sell a business. One of our largest competitors in the industry is the do-it-yourselfer. The business owner who already has all the answers, knows exactly how this is done, and is going to sell their business on their own. And
is there a website for that? I mean,
it's so much more difficult, and I think, there's oftentimes I'll have a discussion and they'll say, I built this business, I understand this business, I know how it's valued, and I know how to sell it. Why should I use a broker? And what people don't really understand, unless they've gone through it, is how complex it can be.
Right.
And how you can either increase or decrease value by just what appears to be perhaps minor differences, but how a buyer is going to perceive that. And one of the things that we can do, and any competent broker can do, is to help you really put together a plan for preparing that business for market.
Yeah, it seems like you've got such a broad experience base to be able to really see all the implications and the downstream implications of just perhaps little flaws. But if that flaw is intact over multiple years, you've got a risk. And I love your example about the personality-driven business dependent on that individual in order to, keep the business. And if that person's removed, we now no longer have a very healthy business. On paper, it might look great, but if you don't have those kinds of perspectives built into the understanding of that business, my gosh, now everybody gets hurt.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And buyers are going to recognize that real quick. And as I said, most of our investors, most of our buyers, they're not gamblers.
But apparently, it seems like there are quite a few gamblers out there. At least the startup entrepreneurial world would have you believe. There are individuals, these are not, companies, but individuals who kind of have the extra cash for whatever reason, and they'd like to place it and put it to work in a way that has a lot of promise. And I think we get bedazzled a little bit by these unicorn stories. And I think it does a disservice actually to the startup entrepreneurial community if the thinking is, I just need to find that gambler who's willing to gamble. I put that in quotes, on my business. And then I'll be able to launch my business and grow it and do all the things that I just need to find that gambling investor. Is that a myth?
I don't think it's a myth. I think there's probably people out there who tend to work on that side of the business world.
As investors?
They're investors, and maybe they do spread their bets, and so they're covering with a lot of different bets,
right?
And they only have to win 5 out of 100 times, or whatever the ratios are that make them successful. So there are those people out there, I suppose. Those are not people we deal with.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
That's not our folks.
Yeah.
That's
well, and it seems so much healthier and balanced. And I think that there isn't a startup or a business whose founders don't want to see that business continue beyond them. I think that once you start investing your blood, sweat, and tears into something with all the conviction of meeting the needs of your clients and your customers, you want to see that continue over time, and be able to point to it as a legacy of what you invested in your time with your life,
right.
Is in that business. And I think there's no better compliment to that than seeing your business acquired successfully, and to see not only your employees thrive and continue to have jobs and employment, but also be in a market that appreciates what you're doing in the world.
Well, I think it's a testimony to the business owners. It really speaks of the business owner who says, I want to leave a legacy here. I want my people taken care of. I can tell by firsthand experience that you may think that you're going to walk away from this business and have no emotional attachment to it.
Gosh.
After you've poured yourself into this business for all of these years, you have seen it grow from the beginning all the way up to this state. You're ready to walk away from it, you think, and you believe that you're going to be able to just wash your hands and never think again about it. That's not typical. We want to see business owners have that sense of responsibility, if you will, post-acquisition for that business.
Sure.
It's a yellow flag for us if that business owner is just ready to wash their hands and walk away, and is insistent upon not being engaged after the acquisition is done, because that puts a big risk on the buyer at that point.
Of course.
So we're looking for that emotional engagement. We play a lot of different roles. We're financial advisors, we're business brokers. I tell people sometimes I'm Dr. Phil.
Yeah.
And, I have to understand the psychology of the seller and the buyer, and try to, understand what's motivating each, and make sure that there's a good match there. But when I'm sitting down with most business owners and we're working through this and we're preparing to take that business to market, or we get into the offer stage and the due diligence stage, then you really start seeing how emotionally attached they are to their business.
Right.
And that, to me, is a good thing.
Yeah, it sure is. Awkward, but boy, you sure want that investment.
That's correct.
From them. Great. Yeah. Well, I am super inspired and excited and appreciative of this initial conversation around exits and exit strategies. I can't think of anyone else who I'm aware of who could lend as much value as you have in these last 45 minutes to talk about mergers and acquisitions, and what needs to be in place, and what any startup and entrepreneur needs to be aware of when looking down into the future around how they want to leave the company that they've built. And I'm looking forward to, again, this series on mergers and acquisitions and exit strategies, because I think this is an important element for anybody who decides to start a business, is being aware that at some point they're going to want to be thinking about the exit, and thinking about that early on. And I think you're a rare breed to have thought about that from the beginning, but maybe not, I don't know. But to be thinking about that from the very beginning has got to be baked into decisions and operations and systems in your business from the get-go.
Well, Trey, I really appreciate it again, being able to come, and we look forward to continuing this conversation.
Yeah.
We look forward to continuing to work with you and others in Western North Carolina and small business owners throughout the Southeast and helping them recognize their dreams.
Nice.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. All right. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Nice. Good. That was easy. Super good.
Easy peasy.
Yeah.
I'd love to get into more detail, maybe.
Uh-huh.
as
We could
things
do a
progress.
part